he recognizes the value of elections and democracy and the language of democracy, but uses that also to sort of establish a Hindu ethnocracy, which makes it clear that the government has a Hindu first policy.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Indrajit Roy. Indrajit is Professor of Global Development Politics at the University of York. One of his areas of expertise is Indian politics. As India, the world's biggest democracy, is currently going to the polls, I invited Indrajit to discuss the state of Indian democracy and his new book, Audacious Hope, an archive of how democracy is being saved in India. Indrajit, welcome.
Thanks, Adam. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
It's great to have you. So let's get straight into it. What is the state of Indian democracy? So we are recording in the last week of May here. The polls close in the beginning of June, and I'm assuming some of the counting will take a bit of time, but soon in the next few weeks, we'll know if Modi has consolidated and increased his power or not. So I think the world is watching and listening, particularly those that are pro-democrats, pro-democracy. What do we need to know about Indian democracy, the biggest democracy in the world?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. I think it's worth sort of reminding everyone, you say India is the biggest democracy in the world, but what does that really mean? In these elections, we have almost 1 billion people going to vote. Yeah. That's more than the combined populations of the United States, Brazil, Russia, Britain, France, and you want to throw in the Netherlands and Belgium if you like. So that's the scale we are talking about. People will put their vote in over 1 million polling booths. So that's the number. That's the logistical sort of arrangements that have been made. So it's vast. It's huge. Just in terms of scale. Now, India is a parliamentary democracy, and Indians would cast their vote using, the election principle is the first past the post system, so which is something that India borrowed from Britain. So in that sense, we cast a single vote at a point of time. But I think you also should remember that India is a union of states. So when we think about Indian democracy, there's the national parliament, and there are state legislative assemblies. So at this point, we are voting for the national parliament. But yes, it's huge. It's a massive exercise. And in some ways, you could say that Indian democracy, of course, is essential for Indian politics. But depending on where you are on the political spectrum, if you're a pro-democracy person, you would say Indian democracy is a global public good. And that's because, without democracy in India, democracy appears to be the preserve of, the industrialized, capitalist, white majority Western countries. I'm not suggesting that India is the only European country, but, just the numbers of people that we mentioned mean, really give democracy that global element to it. I think it's also useful to remember the foundations of democracy in India. When India became a democracy back in 1950, not many people thought it would survive as a democracy, much less as a nation state. It was too poor, too agricultural, too rural. Illiteracy was rampant, and that defies the usual understandings of the political economy of democracy, as it were. Yet India instituted adult franchise back in 1950. That, as your viewers will know, was almost 15 years before the United States sort of got rid of the various literary and property qualifications on its minorities, on its black minorities. So in that sense, the foundations were quite, you could say, disjunctive vis-a-vis, what we understand as the political economy of democracy. But, barring a 19-month sort of interregnum in the 70s, Indian democracy has at least formally, procedurally remained durable. There are challenges to it in the last decade, which we'll discuss in a bit, but it's remained more or less stable. One of the aspects of Indian democracy, I think that again we need to bear in mind, is the idea of affirmative action
Hmm.
because of deeply entrenched social and economic inequalities in India. When the country adopted its constitution in 1950, the leaders were very clear that there should be affirmative action for historically oppressed communities who are called Dalits or
Hmm.
scheduled castes, as well as Adivasis or scheduled tribes, loosely
So
translated
that's
into
the
indigenous sort
right,
of populations. So
and
the
Dalits would
so-called
be the
the,
untouchables.
the so-called
Yes.
untouchables, yes. So the so-called untouchables, the indigenous populations, etc., had affirmative actions guaranteed for them. And finally, to just again remember that India became independent amidst a terrible partition between Hindu majority India and Muslim majority Pakistan. And there were lots of demands back then for India to be declared a Hindu state, mirroring Pakistan becoming a Muslim state, and to expel minorities, especially Muslims, from India. Thanks to India's leadership at that point, none of those demands were sort of allowed to be seriously taken. And Indian democracy was very clear that everyone who lived in India, who was Indian, would be given equal rights, equal status, as you would expect in a
Mm.
liberal democracy. And that sort of constitutional guarantee protection was extended to everyone who was Indian. Religion was never allowed to become a criteria, a marker of citizenship. So I think in some, if you sort of understand Indian democracy, it's far from perfect. There are enormous social and economic inequalities that continue. Civil liberties have not been, perfectly sort of protected, but at least if you look at the constitution, if you look at on paper, this is what Indian democracy is, and it sort of combines liberal rights with group rights, and
Hmm.
has become uniquely Indian, as it were. Lots of people say democracy is Western, democracy is, a European import, but Indians will say thank you very much, but this is we've made it our own. And there are parts of India where you'll have little placards which sort of proclaim themselves to be, democratic far before democracy was founded in
Hmm.
Greece. We can laugh at that, but there is the idea that democracy is very Indian.
Well, I mean, I think it's when you hear arguments that democracy is a uniquely Western construct. I mean, for obviously there's lots of history there and thinking around it, but even still, the idea then that because even if it is you know came from Greece, that you can't export it and it can't be you have to have some kind of Western
Yeah,
heritage for it to work, I think is absurd.
yeah,
And you just look at Taiwan is
yes,
active, lively
exactly,
democracy. Japan, South
exactly,
Korea, right? So in other cultures, other kind of other
absolutely,
societies with different histories, democracy can flourish
exactly.
and thrive. And so the
Mm,
idea, I always find that that argument is used by those that don't want democracy to say, well, it's
absolutely.
you have to have a particular cultural thing. And I think actually no, it's the values of democracy can spread and they can thrive
Mm,
elsewhere. And obviously, I
mm,
think local conditions and
mm,
histories
mm,
shape democratic outcomes
mm,
and procedures in various ways. And I think
mm.
that's fine and expected as long as the principles of democracy
Indeed.
are still maintained. On that,
Indeed.
I mean, how effective has democracy been? So you can look at the structure and say, it's Indian democracy since 1950,
Mm,
notwithstanding a short period in the 70s,
mm,
is functioning.
mm.
How effective is it in
Yeah.
terms of providing those that are part of the franchise with
Mm,
a voice? With Are they getting something for their democratic vote?
yeah. I think that's a really good point to raise. I mean, democracy is not just about the institutions, it's
Hmm.
not just about holding free and fair elections or about ensuring checks and balances. It's also a social process, right? It's about ensuring that people are treated as equals.
Hmm.
It's about, ensuring social and economic equality. And in that respect, I think India's democratic record has certainly been mixed.
Hmm.
There are enormous levels of social inequality. Some have argued that inequality has in fact increased in the last decade or so, or even before that. Others have said that yes, it is a mixed bag because economic inequality has increased. Yes, but if you look back, say, from the 1980s onwards, social representation in India's parliament, as well as the state assemblies, have also become more diverse. So many more people are now becoming a part of the elected institutions than they were before. And that, in that respect, Indian democracy certainly seems to have given a voice to many sections of the population. I mentioned historically oppressed communities earlier,
Hmm.
the so called untouchables, the so
Hmm.
called Adivasis. You do see an enormous number of people from these communities who have taken political position, political power, even if the economic sort of equality and social economic equality hasn't followed. So
Hmm.
there is a disjunct, as it were. Um, and I think that's part of the India story. That sort of tells you that when you think about effectiveness,
Hmm.
it's a mixed bag. India continues to rank rather low on various human development indicators, on various other sorts of indicators, and that's certainly true. But at least from the period of 1989, when the party system became much more diverse, till about 2014, when you had coalition governments ruling the roost, you did have quite impressive rates of economic growth. You did have very extensive welfare systems put in place. You had an extension of affirmative action
Hmm.
programs for
Hmm.
various communities, but that went hand in hand. That wasn't enough to stymie inequality. And so I think you have these two things, somewhat operating against each other,
Right.
that have made up Indian democracy over the last few decades.
It,
And it's not quite clear what's going on, because is it that political representation is a sort of, is a way to sugarcoat the hard reality of economic inequality?
hmm.
I think that's being unfairly reductionist, because the
Hmm.
political representation hasn't happened because of the gift of people. It's happened as a result of social movements,
Hmm.
very very strong social movements that have permeated Indian society. But the reality of social inequality and economic inequality persists, as data tells you.
Right.
So there is this twofold sort of response to your excellent question.
Right. And so, just as a counterfactual, what would be, I mean, this is, I guess, speculative. What would India have been like if democracy wasn't established in 1950? Would it be, I
Yeah,
mean, again, because, you think about Singapore,
yeah,
you think about, I mean, China's relative kind of
of
economic
course,
success,
of
though
course,
there's
yeah,
big inequality problems in China. And, there's always that sort of the enlightened authoritarian will tell you that,
yeah,
well,
yeah,
no, or, Paul Kagame in Rwanda said, well,
exactly,
I need to be a strong man. And yeah, sometimes there's a certain sense of, just providing basic things, if there's going to be too much confusion and fighting amongst people, then you're not going to get things done. And some of these enlightened authoritarians will say, well, I just don't have time for opposition
yeah,
because I'm getting things done. And
yeah,
sometimes they are getting things done,
yeah. Mm.
but at the expense of a lot of civil liberties. But I'm just curious, if you could speculate, what would India be like had it been more authoritarian? Would it have
Yeah.
been worse, potentially?
Yeah. I think lots of people on both the left and the right of the political spectrum would, support the view that had India had an authoritarian regime
Hmm.
right in 1947, it would have been able to get past all of these problems, as it were.
Hmm.
My own view is based on the fact that the Congress Party in its first 2 decades was in fact running a one party state. I mean,
Hmm.
of course, it allowed elections,
Yeah.
but it always won those elections. And
Right.
that's in some ways because the opposition was so splintered. There was no alternative, which is
Yeah.
something we hear.
Hmm.
And Nehru was, Jawaharlal Nehru, India's
Yeah.
first prime
Hmm.
minister, was in some ways an enlightened authoritarian.
Hmm.
Although, of course, he always spoke the language of democracy. And to give him credit, he did believe that democracy was something that was the best or the least evil of all forms
Hmm.
of government. So I think a lot of India's early success may well have boiled down to Nehru and the Congress Party's ability to actually push an agenda. So in
Hmm.
that sense, we're not being too counter speculative. In the
Hmm.
sense, you did have an enlightened authoritarian in
Yeah.
place. But we also know that it was again a mixed bag because you had these large infrastructure projects,
Hmm.
but the data just suggested that poverty reduction was extremely stubborn. In fact, I think there was some evidence that after the first 2 decades of independence, despite the large scale investment on dams and hydroelectric powers and
Hmm.
other kinds of infrastructure, poverty had actually increased, not
Hmm.
decreased. So, I mean, my own view is, to answer your question more pointedly, I don't think an enlightened despot in that sense would have necessarily, helped us overcome these tensions.
Hmm.
Because I think for a country the size of India, given the diversity of India's population, there's, if you got one thing right, you'd probably get the other thing wrong.
Hmm.
And I suspect in that sense, democracy was, with all its imperfections, warts and all, the best, we had, or the least evil, as it were.
Right.
I suppose what could have been the case was a little more sort of cohesion among the bureaucracy, the legislature, and the judiciary, because there was a constant sort of intra-elite conflict which they needed to sort out.
Right.
And I think we saw that with Nehru's sort of success, not immediate successor, but Nehru's daughter, Mrs. Gandhi, when she
Hmm.
became prime minister, she tried to really take on the mantle of an enlightened authoritarian even further. And for those 19 months that India had formally sort of ceased to be a democracy, she was in charge. And she made all these arguments, really, that,
Hmm.
it's a splintering country, someone needs to take charge, someone needs to take the agenda forward. And there was a very intriguing piece in the Third World Quarterly, no less, in 1979, written by one of her cousins or nephews or somebody. I don't know how it made it past the review process, but which
Hmm.
said exactly what you just said. Democracy is a luxury that poor people can't afford. They need an authoritarian regime. Of course, it was defending the emergency.
Hmm.
I think the peer review process meant it actually came out after the emergency had been lifted, but that's a different
Okay.
story. Anyway, to answer your question, so we've
Yeah.
had our brush with authoritarians of various kinds, and the story isn't very pretty either.
Isn't
So
exactly.
I think
You know.
we'll stick to democracy.
Yeah. So, well, moving on. I mean, so the Indians are now voting. As you said, a billion people are going to the polls, which is breathtaking when you think about it. And we assume, or at least when I read the international press, the assumption is that Modi will likely win, or at least consolidate some of his power. We don't need to speculate on it. I think whether his power is decreased or increased is worthy of discussion. Um, but there is that perception, at least outside of India, as I understand it, that, like we just said, Modi is kind of portraying himself or comes off as a slightly authoritarian. I would say is probably too harsh of a term. I mean, India is still a democracy,
Mm.
but he's he's put in the same camp as Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. The at least some put him in that kind of radical
Mm,
right grouping where they are seen to be, although duly elected legally, are undermining the democratic process, and so they come
mm,
off as authoritarian. Whether that's
mm,
an exaggeration or not, I don't necessarily want to get into that. But I guess, what has Modi done to Indian democracy and
mm,
to liberal Indian democracy?
mm.
Liberal in the
Again,
classical sense.
yeah. No, I think again, I mean, it's a great question. Of course, if you recall that Indian democracy was, sort of a hybrid affair,
Mm-hmm.
mixing liberal with, other sorts of tendencies, which is, as we discussed earlier, to be expected. But I think if you think about, a key component of liberal democracy being consultation, and taking decisions in consultation with other elected
Mm-hmm.
representatives, for example,
Mm-hmm.
you do see a significant disempowerment of the national parliament. In the
Mm-hmm.
sense, very few bills are actually discussed in the parliament before they are enacted. Your readers might remember the demonetization fiasco in India,
Right.
where large high value currency notes were, tendered illegal within a matter of hours. And that decision was taken ostensibly to curb corruption. So there was a lot of talk about how it needed to be secret, but the point is, it was not discussed in
Mm-hmm.
parliament. So that element of consultation was just something that was missing. Another key, sort of component of a liberal democracy, which Indians really cherished in their democracy, was political opposition.
Mm-hmm.
You treat political adversaries with respect. You treat them as adversaries, not as enemies.
Mm-hmm.
But what you've seen in the present sort of system is targeting of political adversaries,
Mm-hmm.
putting people you don't like into prison on grounds that they are anti-national, that they are seditious,
Mm-hmm.
that they are threatening not only the government but the territorial integrity of India. And I think that's obviously a departure not only from liberal democracy but from India's own democratic sort of understandings. You see a fall in journalistic and academic freedoms. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that was celebrated about Indian society was the ability to voice dissent, to sort of express views that were often critical not only of the government but of the or of the idea of India, but also which would challenge the majority Hindu faith, which would point out the weaknesses in Hinduism, which would look at the injustices within Hinduism. All of that is now treated as being as fostering enmity between
Mm-hmm.
religions, as being an insult, and there's a clamping down on those sorts of things. So I think that does take us, quite far away from the ideas of democracy. That if you think about democracy as treating people as equals and as sort of respecting political opposition. But what is perhaps really, really worrying in the last decade has been the spike in violence against religious minorities, especially Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
And we've noted, this increase in targeted assaults on Muslims. Now, I don't want anyone to be under the impression that Hindu-Muslim relations have always been, as nice as some liberals would like us to believe. There is a history of conflict. There has been a history of confrontation. I'm not suggesting that that was the only history, but it's not a pretty history. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But in the last 10 years, that has taken that history, that difficult history has been weaponized to target Muslims in a way that really is intended to batter them down and
Mm-hmm.
to, convey to them that they are second class citizens in India. And I think this wholesale targeting of the Muslim minority as if they were second class citizens, and the Prime Minister himself sometimes refers to them as infiltrators, the Home Minister refers to them as termites. So, using dehumanizing language against an entire population is obviously, not democratic, liberal or not. That's not what you call a democracy. And I think added to this, layered onto this, is the very, very real effort to, and which has been successful in some ways, to convert India into what some of us call an Hindu ethnocracy.
Mm.
So the trimmings of democracy are sort of kept and preserved, and in that respect, Modi is perhaps different from the other dictators that you mentioned, in the sense
Mm.
he takes pride in not only being elected to power, but also suggesting that India is the mother of all democracy and that sort of thing. So he recognizes the value of elections and democracy and the language of democracy, but uses that also to sort of establish a Hindu ethnocracy, which makes it clear that the government has a Hindu first policy. So there was, for instance, he presided earlier this year over the inauguration of a temple in northern
Right.
India.
Hmm.
And I mean, I guess you could say, well, what's wrong? It's a Hindu majority country. He's a Hindu. What's wrong if he presides over a temple? Except two things: that that temple itself was built over the site of a mosque that was demolished about 3 decades ago by his own party colleagues, and there was a history to that. And of course, nobody would expect him to extend the same courtesy to a mosque if a mosque was being inaugurated, right? So
Right.
I think in that sense, if you think about, a democracy which treats different people as equals, clearly there's a Hindu first policy that we are beginning to see,
Which,
or at least a Muslim last policy.
right.
There was a debate which your readers, your viewers may be familiar with. There were a few years ago, India sort of passed a law which introduced a religious filter into citizenship.
Mm.
So, if you were a Muslim from one of the neighboring countries seeking citizenship in India, your citizenship could be, your application could be delayed. But if you were a Hindu or a Buddhist or, other religions, then, your citizenship application would be fast tracked. So this looks very minor, in the grand scheme of things. I mean, how many Muslims from the neighborhood would want to take citizenship in India?
Mm.
But if you introduce a religious filter into citizenship, then that opens the path for further sort of, you're going down, you're sliding down a very, very slippery slope. And I think that is fundamentally at odds with the idea of democracy,
Right.
liberal or not.
Yeah, no, I mean,
So
considering that, in the United States, separation of church and state, it was fundamental to the
yeah,
founding.
yeah,
In France, laicite is
yeah,
incredibly strong and powerful.
yeah.
Um, I mean, this doesn't stop, in the United States. It's always, the president always says, God bless you.
Of
And even
course,
if he
and the
doesn't go to
currency
church, it's,
says, yeah, yeah,
and
exactly,
but it's
yeah,
always, you get the religious right that wants to inculcate more religion in schools, more in
yeah,
society,
yeah,
um, which, you can't fault them for wanting to spread their ideas, but there's still that sense of, okay, but we don't all have to accept that. And again,
yeah.
the fundamental point is that the government, the state, shouldn't discriminate. That goes
Yes,
against the
I think
fundamental founding.
I think
um,
that's key. I mean, secularism in India has always been very different from, and self-consciously different from, how it's understood in France and the United
mhm,
States.
mhm,
It was, of course, about separating church and state, but it was more about the state being equidistant from all religions.
mhm, mhm,
So the prime minister could go to Hindu events, but would also turn up at Muslim events, Christian
mhm,
events, etc.
mhm,
Because it's a religious country, and the
mhm,
head of government didn't want to sort of be seen as too divorced from society. But they would always sort of turn up. They would treat everyone as equals, not
mhm.
sort of show up and preside over the inauguration of one group's place of
Yeah.
worship, but demean the others, or distance themselves from others. So I think that respect, there's a fundamental departure, not only from the way we understand secularism generally, but from India's own practice of
Of
secularism.
and the question though is what do the what does Modi and the Hindu nationalists gain from creating? Because I mean, when we think about the Muslim population in India, it's what, 300 million people, or I mean,
Two,
it's
200 million is
200
the
million,
number
right?
we've been, but it's a big number. It's a big
It's a
number.
big number, right? That's a lot of people. That's a lot of potentially very productive citizens,
Mm,
taxpayers, right?
mm,
And
mm,
why would you want to alienate them, treat them
mm.
differently when actually what you want to do is include them because they're I mean, and they're not going to go anywhere, right? It's not
No,
like they're
no.
going to
I
go to
think that's
Pakistan or
yeah, yeah.
Bangladesh
I
and
think that everyone knows. It's just not possible to no matter what delusions and fantasies people might sort of suffer from,
but
they stay. They're here to stay.
is it an election strategy? I mean, is it the sense of, if you compare with, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary, it's kind of Christian values and it's trying to kind of build an identity, which is about building a political support and the like. And I mean, is it necessary? And why I mention Orban is, so he's implemented quite a few, let's say, anti-democratic or undermined free press and the like. But you look at the polls, and Viktor Orban would probably likely win
Mm,
elections without all the
mm,
electioneering, right? I mean, he's popular
mm,
for various reasons, and so it's interesting that you see the leaders that are popular without attacking the bases of a liberal democracy and the institutions we come to respect: free speech, free enterprise, free press. So then what is there to gain from, and I'm assuming that's the same for Modi as well. He has been he's a successful politician, very savvy, and he knows how to win an election. Does he
mm.
need then the Hindu nationalist kind of aura, and these active, or is he just appealing to a specific group within that, I mean, what's the story there?
I think you've sort of touched you've got your finger on the nub of the matter, and that I suppose distinguishes Modi from several of the other gentlemen you mentioned. Um, Hindu nationalism in India isn't a byproduct of Modi's rise. If
Mm-hmm.
anything, Modi is a result of decades of Hindu nationalist activism.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees himself and the government in service of Hindu nationalism.
Okay.
And this, it's a long story, but it goes back to the 1920s, and it involves what a lot of people would call a shadowy sort of organization. I'm going to try and name it anyway for your audience, and I'll
Mm-hmm.
translate it into English.
Okay.
It's called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the National Service Organization.
Okay.
And they came into existence in the 1920s in response to what they saw as growing Muslim aggression, as
Mm-hmm.
well as an increasing, and this is perhaps critical to answering your question, uh, increasing assertion among the so called lower caste, including the untouchable groups.
Mm.
Of course, after 1947, the question of Muslim aggression sort of was, contained, because you had the partition of India between India and Pakistan, and the Muslims who lived in India, well, they were 20% of the population. You could make various arguments about how aggressive, a 20% population can be or not.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is the way in which the BJP in general, supported by the RSS, begins to get more and more traction after the 1980s. And part of that story is the extension of the affirmative action programs that I mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
which used to be historically directed towards the so called untouchables and the indigenous groups. Affirmative action programs were extended to more and more so called low caste communities.
Mm.
So, and this is just very quickly a segue into the caste hierarchy, but the Hindu caste hierarchy, without orientalizing it, it consists of those who are at the top,
Mm-hmm.
the so-called high castes, then those who are sort of beyond the pale of settlement, the so-called untouchables, the indigenous communities. But in between the upper caste, the high caste, and the untouchables, you have a whole plethora of lower caste groups, the
Right.
in-betweeners, if you will.
Right.
And there was a plan to extend affirmative action programs to these in-betweener groups through the 1980s, which many high caste Hindus believed would fracture Hindu society, would destroy it completely. And so you need to sort of build up a cohesive community, they felt. And it was I think the Muslim groups offered a convenient other
Mm.
against whom the Hindu groups could sort of really build up their unity. So if you look at the earliest sort of voting support, electoral support for the BJP, it was typically confined to the upper caste, the high caste groups. And, these would be, I suppose, what the Marxists would call petty bourgeoisie. They would
Hmm.
have their own little shops and, that sort of thing. They would be almost always urban. So that you can't win votes in India with that, of course. But then, when the sort of affirmative action programs were extended in the 1980s, thanks to coalition governments after the Congress Party,
Hmm.
then the high caste Hindus were worried that their obviously position, their dominant position within India and India's political economy would be challenged. Because of course affirmative actions meant more jobs in the public sector, and the public sector was the largest sort of employer. And there was a real pushback, which led to the BJP breaching its upper caste sort of vote base, because more and more people were now sought to be included in the Hindu fold. They were always
Hmm.
Hindus, mind you, but
Right.
they were given more of a Hindu identity under the banner of what's called Hindutva, or
Hmm.
the idea that India ought to be governed according to Hindu principles, whatever
Hmm.
they are.
Right.
So I think you're right in picking up what does anyone get out of demonizing and alienating Muslims? But of course, it's not about the Muslims at all. It's about creating a Hindu
I
homogenous group and to overcome a deeply divisive history, which has sort of pitted caste against one another, in an attempt to a sort of preserve upper caste dominance, but also create a Hindu hegemony, or sorry, a Hindu homogeneous group.
Right. So then the follow on becomes okay. So it's about the upper castes that have the wealth predominantly, or the petty bourgeoisie, as you put it. The Brahmins, right? There's at the and the warrior class, the caste is those are the two. But it's about bringing the, let's say, the working class in, but without having to give them more economic opportunity, right? They give them cultural identity and cultural kind of capital, if you like, to make them
Social
social
status,
status.
yes, yes. And without necessarily buying into the class sort of
Right.
language,
Hmm.
because of course caste is fundamentally a status group, not necessarily class, but there are
Right.
broad overlaps.
Yeah.
I think the key sort of group within the higher caste, of course, there are the Brahmins, the warrior classes. It's not so much, but there's the group called the Banyas, the
Hmm.
mercantile
Uh
castes.
huh.
They're really important. And so you had the Brahmins, the mercantile groups, the bureaucrats who were often Brahmins, but also from another community called the Kayasts. So these three groups really
Hmm.
are the bulk of the upper caste groups in India. In the rural areas, you do have some of the warrior groups. They're called Rajputs,
Hmm.
but their allegiance for all sorts of reasons has been mixed. But it's really these three upper caste groups that were the bulk of the BJP's initial support. But they are a tiny proportion of India's population. They would not account for more than 10% at the max. I think
Mm.
some data would suggest it's 5%. But they do control disproportionately the wealth of the country, as I
Hmm.
think a recent paper by Thomas Piketty and his
Hmm.
colleagues Nitin Bharti and Lucas Chancel, I may have sort of got their pronunciations wrong, but they've sort of shown this, that the bulk of the wealth is sort of concentrated in upper caste hands. And you're right. So it's a way of preserving wealth. Of course, you offer social status, but you also push back against the possibility of public sector jobs then being used to sort of acquire wealth. Because acquiring wealth, it changes people's attitudes towards those on the top.
So
Uh,
I'm curious though. So if it's about extending social status, what is the economic element? Because you can't extend social status and create a community without having some knock-on effects that are inclusive in
yeah,
terms of economic empowerment, right? So I mean,
yeah.
the wealth is still concentrated, but what has that done? Because as I understand it, that's kind of partly the success story of Modi, if I can say that, where there is more economic inclusion of sort of lower caste groups.
So I think the story of economic inclusion of the lower caste groups also predates Modi. And
Okay.
in that respect, I think the sort of social process that was unleashed by affirmative action, social sort of justice movements,
Hmm.
did mean a widening of the economic sort of pyramid, and more people were able to get into it. So I think that's a story that predates Modi.
Hmm.
I suppose what's interesting is Modi himself, sort of shakes things up because he claims to be from a lower caste group, and
Hmm.
he quite likely is. So, in that sense, social status, Adam, is a win-win situation, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
More status to me doesn't. I mean, it could mean less status for you, but it doesn't have to be that. We could all sort of
Yeah.
be in it together. So I think that's the story that they've sort of played along. At some point, there are bound to be cracks. Those cracks haven't appeared yet, although the Piketty sort of data suggests that the increase in the wealth of the upper castes may be at the cost of the wealth of the new wealth that the lower caste
Hmm.
groups were acquiring. But as long as status continues to be redistributed, they may well be able to starve off that problem.
So to play devil's advocate
Yeah.
somewhat, what has Modi done for India that is positive? I mean, we look at the growth figures are positive. There seems to be India has turned a corner. Entrepreneurship is very lively and active. I would say the mood on India is changed, particularly partly because I think the mood on China has soured, and so people are looking at India to say, well, is this going to be the next kind of growth miracle? We see the kind of massive development that
Mm,
China has gone through, and I think it's India's turn. And
mm.
some would credit Modi with doing that, or some of his reforms. So I'm just curious if you could put a positive spin on Modi. What would that be, or what would those that are looking at Modi and happy with his leadership? What would they say that he's done that is positive?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good one because I think one of the if I were to give a positive spin to Modi's rule, he's been able to leverage the enormous goodwill that was already acquired by India on account of high growth, democracy, etc., under his predecessors. So he has, not messed that up in the international stage. So here I'm talking less about performance and more about perception, so
Mm.
he sort of played along with that. Because remember, a lot of this was in place under the coalition governments that preceded
Hmm.
Modi. But what I think one of the areas he may well claim a great deal of, quite credibly, some sort of support is the investments his government has made in infrastructure
Mm.
across the country. It's a big country. There are huge parts of it that remained unconnected. And to give this government credit, in the last 10 years, there certainly appears to be a greater investment in infrastructure and actual construction as well. And infrastructure, as we know, does lots of things. It doesn't only allow sort of trucks to move and trains to move and ships to sort of go back and forth. It also helps in the mobility of people. So
Hmm.
that's a big thing. I suppose the other area that has seen some improvement, at least from what anecdotally one hears, is an improvement in, or a reduction rather, in petty corruption.
Hmm.
So if I were to violate a traffic signal, for instance, I don't have to pay cash, a bribe to the local police person. There are other, I can sort of really just pay,
Hmm.
whatever I needed to. Or if I needed to go and get my land registered, the tiny plot of land that I own, I wouldn't have to pay a bomb to the registrar. It would just get done. And
Hmm.
part of this story, of course, we are told, is that corruption has moved upwards. It's become more centralized. So, the government, the state is not really interested in, collecting tiny bribes. The sort of the bigger the corporate, there are other areas now to sort of seek rent from, if you will.
Hmm.
Um, and the extent of big corruption may have increased enormously. And the recent scandal of the election bonds show, how political parties make money out of dealings with corporates. But at least when it comes to the everyday lives of people, they've seen a definite reduction of corruption, because political parties, local officials, government officers are not interested in them anymore from the point of view of making money.
And just out of curiosity, how was that done? I mean, how'd they get the traffic warden to not take a bribe, or the
So I
registrar
think
to?
one of the things, and that's probably the third thing which I would mention, and some people would say this is great, others would say it's not, is digitization
Yeah.
of financial transactions. So everything, many
Mm.
financial transactions in India, including
Mm.
payment of officials, etc., has now simply been digitized. So
Mm.
it's a pain, of course, because in a country where you don't get power often, you don't have the tower, etc., you don't often get connections. But where you do, it just makes everyone's life presumably easier.
Hmm.
So the traffic warden may well try and get some money out or whatever, but they can't do anything, because the payment of the bribe,
Yeah.
is just
There's a
what do you
record
do?
of it.
What do you do? Yes. Whereas I've seen, and this is based on my own experience, the way in which digitization has, I mean, I'm sure it's come with all kinds of awful sort of
Hmm.
exclusions, because people aren't able to access their welfare entitlements because their biometrics may not match, etc. But if you were to buy vegetables from the local vegetable vendor, for instance, you're no longer haggling over change. The
Hmm.
vegetable is 2 rupees, I have a 10 rupee note, the fellow has to sort of come up with 8 rupees to return to me. It's all digitized. I just have to pay using the app. And it's amazing how app savvy and tech savvy subaltern Indians are. They just everyone has the app downloaded on their phone, and they seem to be very happy about it, because for them the vegetable vendor doesn't have to haggle over 3 or 4 rupees, etc. You just pay using the app. So I'm not saying this is a panacea for all of India's economic ills. We all know the exclusions that technology brings, but I think on these three aspects, the government could potentially sort of claim some credit. Increase in investments in infrastructure, somewhat of a reduction of petty corruption,
Hmm.
and the digitization of payments, in everyday transactions,
And
which
that
makes things.
benefits poor people more.
It does, of course, it benefits the rich
Yeah.
disproportionately more.
Right.
It does benefit the poor. Also, from the point of view of petty corruption, I've seen from my own fieldwork about 15 years ago, people would, if they had to get their welfare benefits, poor people in rural
Hmm.
northern India, if they had to get their welfare benefits, they would have to turn up at the post office,
Hmm.
where the money would have come from Delhi into the postmaster's account. And then
Hmm.
the postmaster would sort of hand over cash and keep 10 or
Probably take.
20%.
Yeah.
And if you were a woman who went to sort of take the money, you would have to deal with all kinds of other obscenities as well.
Right.
Now that the money has gone straight into their accounts,
Hmm.
they don't have to deal with anybody else, really.
Right.
Now, this is part of the broader neoliberal financialization that a lot of my colleagues have very rightly talked about. And it is benefiting someone enormously somewhere along the way. But for the poor rural woman in northern Bihar, she
Hmm.
doesn't have to deal with the obscenities and the vulgarities of the postmaster
Right.
that she would have to deal with earlier. Again, this is something that was already sort of coming into place under Modi's predecessors, but he's really given it a push, especially after the demonetization fiasco, because one of the
Hmm.
things they were really wanting to do was to open bank accounts for everyone. And to some extent, they've been successful with that.
Is there anything else that Modi has done?
I think there's lots of people would point to a plethora of welfare schemes.
Hmm.
But again, in all fairness, The extension of welfare programs was something that the previous government had been doing. Coalition governments in India, welfare was a key plank for them. I think in some cases Modi has kept them, he has extended them, but I wouldn't sort of point that to be, something that he can claim credit for in terms of something that was new and novel.
And
Uh,
just one more question on Modi. I mean, has he? I mean, on the international stage, he's been effective, correct? I mean, in the
I
sense
mean,
that he's got a
you tell me.
profile.
You tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess here's the question. I mean, you're based in the UK, but you go back to India. I mean, the for you as an Indian living outside the UK, what's your perception of the position of India on the world stage under Modi?
Look, I'll be very honest with you. I came to the UK in 2008
Mm-hmm.
when the previous government was in power. And I have to say, and I don't want to jinx things, but, people, when they heard I was from India or I was Indian, I have not faced a shred of any kind of discrimination. In fact, people would always be more, very keen to hear more from me.
Mm-hmm.
They were especially keen to know more about my prime minister, who at that time was the soft spoken Manmohan Singh.
Mm-hmm.
And I think uh, Dr. Manmohan Singh really commanded a great deal of respect. He was silent, he was quiet, but he knew what he was talking about. He wasn't a showman, and I think a lot of people appreciated that about him.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying people's perception of me has declined after 2014, but if there's been a change, in how Indians perceive themselves to be seen, I haven't seen any change because I was treated very well all along. So I'm sorry if I'm going to disappoint, your
No,
listeners, but I can't possibly say that I've seen a, massive shift in, world
right.
attitudes towards India on account of our prime minister.
But in terms of the geopolitics, right, where India is kind of having to play a bigger. I mean, we probably need more time to discuss that. But
Yeah,
in the rise of China and India's
of
kind of
course.
conflict. I mean, it's becoming the geopolitics and India's place in the world has become more significant and more
Of
impact.
course,
Yeah.
absolutely. There's no question of that. And I think there you're quite right. There are other things that are happening. And what this
Mm-hmm.
government has done is not to make a mess of things, I suppose,
Okay.
by, frittering away whatever, chances we had. But as you just mentioned, I think a rising China is causing a great deal of, worries to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But remember, India and China have a border dispute that goes way back decades.
Yeah.
And to be honest, on that specific border dispute, the Modi government has been extremely ineffective
Mm-hmm.
because we have evidence, and the foreign minister, the Minister of External Affairs, has admitted as such that China occupies parts of Indian territory. And he says in a podcast, this is the Minister of External Affairs telling his interviewer, "What do you want me to do? They are the stronger power." So I'm not sure that that's, evidence of anything. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
the global situation has changed. You're quite right. The geoeconomic situation has changed. It's also fair to say that Indian companies are now in a sort of, more confident, they're more confident of investing overseas. And we've talked about this, Adam.
Mm-hmm.
Indian companies are even, able to make headway or thinking of making headway into European markets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you do have greater capacity in India now to reach out to European markets, and some of that definitely has to do with government support. But I would be wary of saying that, of crediting this government with all of that, because they
Right.
are building on,
Previous.
the previous sort of, understandings and arrangements.
Well, I think that's like any government. They want to take credit for,
Absolutely, absolutely.
as
But
much as.
as you mentioned, and I agree with this, the geopolitical situation is changing.
Mm-hmm.
The West, as we know, isn't in that kind of a position as it used to be,
Mm-hmm.
15, 20 years ago. And I think China's growing belligerence has sort of worried a lot of people that they were putting all their eggs into one basket. And it's about time, frankly, that
Mm-hmm.
people got worried about that one basket into which they were
Mm-hmm.
putting all their eggs. I think the Indo-Pacific strategy that we are seeing is probably a good one for India to continue cultivating. Again, we know the seeds of that were sown back in
Hmm.
2007 when President Abe and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh were meeting. And President Abe's famous speech about the confluence of two oceans was made in the Lok Sabha with Manmohan Singh presiding, not Prime Minister Modi. So I have rather strong views on this.
Okay, well, we need another podcast to discuss
Yes,
that.
we
But
do indeed.
the last question or the last kind of discussion point I want to have is so your book, and thank you for sending me a copy, Audacious Hope.
Hmm.
This is printed in India. This one, right? So it's available in the Indian market, but it's available on Kindle.
Exactly. Yes.
Outside of India. Hopefully, at some point, it'll be marketed here in Britain, perhaps the United States, and in the rest of the world, because it is a very accessible book that, for those that know little about Indian politics in the current state, it's helpful. But the Audacious Hope is the title, and the subtitle is an archive of how democracy is being saved. And you talk, you discuss much of what we've been discussing now, but and again, the concern with a lot of, I think, Indians of a liberal bent of, that believe in civil society and free speech. They're fighting back and they're pushing back against some of these illiberal tendencies. So on that, can we be hopeful for India,
Mhm.
right? What is this resistance? How durable is it? And on the other side, and this is perhaps speculative, will Modi moderate?
Mhm.
Um, I mean,
Mhm.
assuming he wins, even if he doesn't win, I mean, I think Hindu nationalism is still going to be a force in India, as I understand it, for some
Mhm.
time. What can we
Mhm.
expect?
So I think those are two really good questions, and I'm glad you bring them up because much of the talk about backsliding in India, India's the erosion of democracy, assumes that there is no pushback
Hmm.
against it, and nothing can be further from the truth. There are, of course, pockets of institutional resistance where the courts sort of take a view once in a way that push back against the government's overbearingness. The recent scandal over the election bonds, for instance, where
Hmm.
political parties were sort of in cahoots with corporates, was exposed thanks to the work of the courts, work of the
Hmm.
judiciary. And so, of course, the judiciary has also been sometimes compliant and complicit with what the government has done. But there are pockets of institutional resistance.
Hmm.
There are also pockets of political resistance where opposition political parties have in the states. And remember, right in the beginning, I talked about India being a union of
Yeah.
states. So even though in the national parliament, the BJP enjoys a crushing majority,
Hmm.
in several state assemblies, you have opposition parties that have
Hmm.
been able to resist the BJP sort of onslaught. And they may not be paragons of liberal democracy themselves, but at least on the question of religious rights, caste rights, they are very clear that India belongs to everyone
Hmm.
and all its citizens. So I think there is that element of political resistance. And you mentioned earlier the enlightened authoritarianism, and I talked about Jawaharlal Nehru and
Hmm.
Indira Gandhi. If you looked at the political map of India when they were sort of the leading the country, you'd find the Congress party in power in the center as well as in several states. So the map of India would be almost entirely Congress dominated. Today's map would be much more fractured because
Hmm.
you would have the BJP with its overbearing majority in Delhi, in the central government as well
Hmm.
as in some states, but many other states, especially in the east and the south, would be ruled by the opposition. This has not always translated into opposition unity when it comes to contesting parliamentary elections, because many of these political parties are sort of internally at odds with each other. Sometimes they're accused of being too much on the left, sometimes they're accused of being too much on the right. So
Hmm.
they haven't really been able to come up with a coherent message, a unified coherent message, which is why the political resistance at the central level has been rather weak. But which is why, and that's the focus of my book, the social aspects of resistance, as distinct from the institutional and the political ones, become really, really important. The role that civil society actors, that social activists, that anti caste activists, for example, people protesting caste discriminations, have put up against the sort of erosion of democracy. The role of students and the way students have really protested against some of the most unjust laws, including the law that I mentioned, which sought to introduce a religious filter in citizenship. We saw this during the pandemic as well, when the government was busy sort of dividing and polarizing population along religious lines. But people overcame those sorts of polarized identities and worked together to provide each other relief. I mean, it was a coping mechanism, but they did the best they could. The farmers, peasants, as they have often been described, people who sort of own tracts of land across northern and western India, when they were faced with laws that could potentially endanger their livelihoods, they sort of came together and marched onto Delhi to protest those laws. And of all the groups I've mentioned, the farmers have probably been the most successful in forcing the government to back down. They were not, politically affiliated with this or that party. Obviously, political parties scrambled to support them, but by and large, this was a social sort of site of resistance that we see. And finally, I think what would be most interesting to your viewers would be the role of entertainers in pushing back against democratic backsliding. It's often said about hegemony having cracks. And it's these entertainers who showed those cracks, from time to time, and exposed the limits of hegemony, so to speak. So I think there are these sorts of the social resistors, if you will, have really pushed back against the erosion of Indian democracy. Now, whether they succeed or not is quite a different matter, because elections, as you mentioned, are the result of lots of other kinds of political maneuverings. But one thing is for certain, that Hindu nationalism, and this is to answer the second part of your question, Hindu nationalism isn't about to disappear anytime soon. If the BJP wins a third time, it's likely to be even more aggressive about Hindu nationalism, because it would have believed quite correctly that it has the mandate to push forth with some of its plans. If they were to lose, they would remain sort of committed to the idea of Hindu nationalism, irrespective of who leads the party. Remember, this idea goes back at least to 1925, and the RSS, the body I mentioned, will be celebrating its centenary next year. So whether their people are in power or not, they are going to make a big song and dance about their existence. And that's not going away anytime soon, irrespective of the outcome of those elections. But I suppose if the BJP wins, Hindu nationalism will be much more aggressive. If the BJP loses, then they'll sort of be on the back foot for a while. But it would be foolish to think that they will disappear,
No,
because
I mean, I think,
they haven't in the last 100 years. They're not about to
but
anytime soon.
to me, it's maybe I'll just put a positive spin. I mean, notwithstanding, Indian democracy sounds healthy, if I can say that, in the sense that sometimes there's a sense of democracy should be this kind of get together where we all just kind of hold hands, and no, democracy's messy and people
Yeah,
don't agree with each other and there's
of
different
course,
groups, and
of
it's
course, of course.
it's a continuous struggle to come
Mm,
together and to
mm,
decide on what we as a society
mm,
want within a
mm,
democracy. So you expect those kinds of pushes and pulls, and
mm.
I mean, I tend to be kind of of a positive point. I mean, I think democracy is durable as a form
Of
of
course, of
governance.
course, of course. Yeah,
India's lasted in its experiment with democracy for a few generations now,
yeah, yeah,
um, and I think once you establish it, it's hard to really roll it back.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you
I
can
mean,
have some.
I think you're right. Sorry
No, no,
if I
no,
may
no. It's
just. I
fine.
mean, I think you're right in the sense that when it comes to the formal procedural sort of aspects of democracy, it's very unlikely that that's going to be rolled back.
Yeah,
So lots of people who talk about this
yeah,
being India's last elections, blah blah blah. I wouldn't go that far.
yeah.
But what I am worried about, and what I
Mm-hmm.
think we should all be worried about, including those, especially those who sort of, believe very strongly in the liberal elements of
Mm-hmm.
democracy, is the introduction of these religious languages of
Yeah.
exclusion.
Yeah.
And you're right, of course, that 200 million Muslims aren't, going to be, I mean, there's a lot of genocidal talk that
Mm.
sort of, goes on. And, obviously that's worrying to everyone. But that's really where the nub of the matter is, the
Mm.
exclusion of a large section of your population, even if you may not actually be able to carry out the genocidal
Mm.
acts that you talk about. Just the fact that you can entertain such a thought
Right.
and express it in public, I
Mm-hmm.
think would be the sort of area of worry. And what I think a lot of democracy observers miss out is, focusing there, and they look at
Mm-hmm.
the institutions and the formal aspects and say, oh, all is good, let's move on. It's the discursive, the narrative, the
Yeah.
social aspects which, I would say, are, to be are where people who really care about democracy should really think about,
And
because
that's why we need more
that's where the
open
problem is.
debate, more
Exactly,
expression of
exactly,
ideas,
exactly.
even ideas that we don't like. I mean, that's
Oh,
the thing is,
absolutely, yeah,
we
yeah,
have
yeah.
to be able to. It's the problem is when those in power want to oppress the rights of others to speak
Yes,
because they want to critique what you have to, and that's why I
yes,
think
yes,
we can all agree that is, for me, what a new enlightenment is about is
yeah,
reinforcing the ideas
yeah.
of open debate and dialogue.
Yeah. Oh,
And
absolutely, absolutely. And I think, and I don't know how you want to use this in the conversations,
mm,
and but I think it's also, it just reminded me of the quite central role of the state in all
hmm
of this.
hmm
I think in a lot of liberal sort of narratives, people don't like to talk about the state, or
mm,
they think of the state as an imposition,
mm,
something that should exist in the margins. But I think the India story, irrespective of whether you're pro-democratic or anti, shows the enormously important role of the state
hmm
in ensuring all of this, in
yeah,
ensuring democracy in the first place,
hmm
in sort of acting as a conduit for
hmm
erosion, backsliding, whatever.
hmm
I mean, if you were to think about capitalist democracy in India, you wouldn't be able to think of it without the state.
yeah,
The state is, and of course, the state is central to capitalism anywhere. We
anywhere,
know
yeah,
that. But I
yeah,
think in India, or in India, as in China and in Brazil and in the
yeah.
so-called emerging markets, the state has a really really crucial role.
I think it's only, the anarcho-capitalist uber libertarians that see
Mm,
no role for the state. But I think
mm,
among most classical liberals, if you want to put it that way, see the necessary role in terms of a state, in terms of helping define and enforce rules of the game
mm,
to create that playing field,
mm,
um, where ideas can be shared, where opportunity can be shared.
mm.
Um, and so, no, absolutely. It's like, what is the role of the state? But we need an
Mm.
extra 2 or 3 hours to
Yeah, yeah,
discuss
no, I,
that.
know- I didn't want. I'm
No,
sorry, I
no,
sort
no,
of mentioned that, but I thought I shouldn't give the impression that the state
no,
doesn't play a role, because
no, no, no.
that's also one of the orientalizing sort of
Mm-hmm.
stereotypes about places like India. That the state just sort of exists at the background. As it's all about community and caste and society
No,
and
no,
that sort
no.
of thing.
It's
So
it's it's important.
yeah,
Well, on that note, Indrajit Roy, thanks for being on the podcast. Congratulations on your book. I thought it was a great read, and I think academics that take the time to write books that reach to other audiences rather than just academic audiences is great. So good on you.
thank you for
And
reading.
let's see what happens with the Indian elections.
Yes, we shall exchange notes, I'm sure, at the end
Yes,
of next week.
yes, great. Thank you so
Take
much,
care.
Indrajit.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you
Thanks.
so much. Take care.
Cheers. You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.